We begin in Belarus, where Wagner Group founder Yevgeny Prigozhin is reportedly said to be resigning now. Belarus leader Alexander Lukashenko has been quoted as saying Mr. Prigozhin is in Belarus. According to him, security guarantees have been given just as promised by the Russian president. Meanwhile, President Vladimir Putin has addressed the country's military, hailing them for stopping a civil war following the aborted Wagner rebellion on Saturday. In a meeting with top officials, President Putin said Russia was not forced to withdraw military united to take part in what he calls the special military operation in Ukraine in order to put down the mutiny. The Wagner mutiny was an unprecedented challenge to Vladimir Putin's authority. But in his address, he made no mention of the deal the Kremlin had with the Wagner Group for their leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, to move to Belarus. Russia's defense ministry says preparations are underway for Wagner to hand over its military hardware, implying the group could be disbanded. The Wagner Group head made his first address since the event on Saturday, saying his short-lived rebellion was a response to government plans to take direct control of the mercenary group. Well, the Kremlin, on the other hand, does not agree with what it called the opinion of pseudo-specialists that the aborted mutiny by the Wagner at the weekend had shaken President Putin's position on the war. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov says instead it has portrayed the Russian leader as just having acted judiciously to avoid the worst-case scenario by giving time for talks to yield a deal that ended with the mutiny without more bloodshed. There were reports that some Russian helicopter pilots were killed on Saturday after being ordered to engage a mercenary convoy headed to Moscow, which shot them down, but a further escalation and wider conflict was avoided. Mr. Peskov says the level of public consolidation around the president is very high and that the events demonstrated just how consolidated the society is around the president. He insists that the Kremlin has no information on the whereabouts of the Wagner leader. In the meantime, U.S. President Joe Biden says the uprising by the Wagner Group mercenaries against the Kremlin is part of a struggle within the Russian system and that the U.S. and its allies were not involved in it. During an event at the White House, President Biden addressed the dramatic power struggle that erupted over the weekend when mutineers barreled towards Moscow only to stop before reaching the capital. Mr. Biden said that he had directed his national security team to update him on the situation hour by hour and to prepare for a range of scenarios which he did not give details about. The U.S. president has spoken with key allies via video conference to make sure everyone is on the same page and coordinated in their response. Meanwhile, the national security spokesperson John Kirby also says that the U.S. used various diplomatic channels to send a message to Russia that there was no U.S. involvement in the uprising against the Kremlin. He said messages were sent over the weekend but did not say how Moscow responded.
We had good, direct communications with the Russians over the course of the weekend. It's our expectation that that would be able to continue going forward. But it's just too soon to know, after the weekend's events, where Wagner goes as an entity or where Mr. Prigozhin goes in terms of his leadership of it. We've seen no indication. Outside of the blustery rhetoric, we've seen no indication that there's any intent to use nuclear weapons inside Ukraine. And I can also assure you that we've done nothing, we've seen nothing that would compel us to change our own strategic deterrent posture. We have, as you know, the ability near the plant to monitor radioactivity, and we just haven't seen any indication that threat is imminent, but we're watching it very, very closely. It's too soon to know what the future of Wagner is going to be. We're going to stay focused on the group. Of course, we have to. They do operate outside of Ukraine, and we have levied lots of sanctions against them, and we'll continue to hold them accountable as appropriate. We also made clear to all our allies and partners that the United States was not involved and would not get involved in these events, and that we view them as internal Russian matters.
We're focusing now on the situation in Ukraine. The UN's monitoring mission has revealed Russia detained more than 800 civilians since the conflict began last year, 77 of whom were executed. In its 36-page report based on 70 visits to detention centers and more than 1,000 interviews, the UN says Ukraine also violated international law by arbitrarily detaining civilians, but on a considerably smaller scale. Head of the UN Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, Matilda Wagner, told a press conference by video link from Uzhhorod, Ukraine, that over 900 cases of detention were documented, but the vast majority of the cases were perpetrated by the Russian Federation. Ms. Wagner says that the executions by Russia amounted to a war crime.
From the beginning of its armed attack, Russia began to detain civilians in areas that it occupied. It carried out what appeared in some cases to be security detentions, but in a manner that did not protect civilians or comply with international law. We documented 864 individual cases of arbitrary detention by the Russian Federation, many of which also amounted to enforced disappearances. Civilians were often detained during so-called filtration in occupied territory for their perceived support of Ukraine, their status as former Ukrainian service persons, or their perceived political opinions or affiliation. We documented over 900 cases of arbitrary detention of civilians, including children and elderly people. The vast majority of these cases were perpetrated by the Russian Federation. Ukraine gave us unimpeded confidential access to official places of detention and detainees, with one exception. The Russian Federation did not grant us such access despite our requests. Many civilian detainees were held incommunicado in unofficial places of detention, often in deplorable conditions. In about a quarter of the documented cases, civilian detainees were transferred to other locations within occupied territory or deported to the Russian Federation. Often no information was disclosed to their families for prolonged periods of time. We documented the summary execution of 77 civilians while they were arbitrarily detained by the Russian Federation. Russian armed forces, law enforcement and penitentiary authorities engaged in widespread torture and ill-treatment of civilian detainees. Most of those we interviewed said that they had been tortured and ill-treated, and in some cases subjected to sexual violence. Torture was used to force victims to confess to helping Ukrainian armed forces, compel them to cooperate with the occupying authorities, or intimidate those with pro-Ukrainian views.
Let's expand this conversation. Joining me on the program now is security expert David Otto, who joins me from Abuja. David, great to see you today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, certainly. So it has now been confirmed that Yevgeny Prigozhin is in Belarus and that the Russian president earlier today was praising the military for preventing a coup. Some have said the whole thing was President Putin's master plan, as Prigozhin could provide a front for Russia from Belarus. What do you think?
There are several angles, and we have heard a lot from people like, President Putin. He spoke yesterday widely in terms of, what had transpired in the last 72 hours. He talked about the rebellion being quelled. He talked about the fact that Russians have united. But I think what is clear is that there has been a lot of talk, from the West about some of the weaknesses that has been established as a result of this. But what is very clear is that, Prigozhin, made it very clear that, he came to the conclusion that the Russian Ministry of Defense was preventing the Wagner troops, from continuing and fighting in the war. But they also had issues of integration of the Wagner forces into the Ministry of Defense, of course, because, Prigozhin has always been the leader of this movement. But I think why President Putin has been quite disturbed, is the fact that these, Wagner forces left the war front, they left Ukraine. And, Prigozhin says, this was a protest march, towards Moscow to express their grievances with the Ministry of Defense. But that hasn't gone down well. He has been sent to Belarus. We do not know if he's been exiled or, but what we know is that, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, made it very clear that the Wagner forces that are based in Ukraine will either sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense or they will go home. So we don't know what is going to happen next. But the Ministry of Defense has made a statement today saying that they've been taking away some of the equipment from the Wagner forces. So it's not very clear where we are at the moment. But what is clear is that this has been a very disturbing news for Russia in the past 72 hours.
Right. And why do you think the Russian president seems to be very forgiving of the head of the Wagner mercenary group and his action on Saturday?
There are several reasons. One of these is that, someone like Prigozhin has known Vladimir Putin for a very long time. And he has been in the front line. Mostly. He's been one of the mercenaries leaders that took out Bakhmut, which was a long fight, between Ukrainians and Russians. So this is somebody that Vladimir Putin relies on in terms of fighting his wars. So he does, have some level of empathy. And one of the concerns that Prigozhin raised was that the Ministry of Defense was not forthcoming in terms of operational and logistical supplies, which led to many of his men. Perhaps, Vladimir Putin has seen this as a weakness in the strategy of the Ministry of Defense, and therefore believes that something needs to be done. And Prigozhin may actually be giving him very good information that would lead to him prosecuting this war. But also remember that part of Russia's foreign policy in terms of military deployment in about 6 countries in Africa relies very much on the Wagner forces. If he, treats Prigozhin in a much more, in a different manner, in such a way that is more or less retaliatory, what we might see is Russian foreign policy collapsing, especially in Africa, where Prigozhin has a lot of Wagner forces there. So I think what Putin is doing is perhaps, trying to be very sure in terms of how he deals with this situation. But mind you, one doesn't know if Putin is ready to open another front in Belarus. We do not know if this is an exile. We don't know if this is another strategy of Putin's to, kind of place some of the Wagner forces quite close to Kiev, which is in a different position to which they were before.
Well, many people are following this latest dimension. I know some world leaders are waiting for the events to unfold. What sort of conversation do you imagine is taking place behind the scene? Even President Joe Biden has held conversations with Ukraine allies regarding what has happened. He has asked for hour-by-hour detailing from his own security team about this. So what kind of conversations do you think might be taking place?
I think you've only got to look at the narratives, which has been coming from the Western-linked medias. But of course, it is very clear that if your enemy is in distress, then of course it's a good thing, for you. So I believe that for countries like the United States of America, for the UK, especially for NATO, they've seen these as cracks, within the Russian military strategy, and they will take all advantage of it. Now, I think what they will be talking about is, trying to see how they can exploit the current dynamics, what is going on, and see if there is any way that, they could make this situation much more worse. But, I think there was some level of disappointment, I have to say, from the Western side, when Prigozhin said his men would turn back to the war front. Now, I think what they'll be looking at is to try and see how they can continue to do what, or perhaps, to influence some of the operations that the Russian forces carry out, perhaps to see if they can, perhaps expand and continue to create this kind of scenarios. And who knows, one of these could succeed. But Putin, it's not somebody that, will go down very easily. And I didn't think so in the first place. But let's watch and see. For the West, they've made it very clear that they do not have a hand in this, but of course they are happy to see chaos in Russia.
And what advantage do you think this may have provided Ukraine?
Well, the expectation was that this was going to last longer than 24 hours, Marachi. But of course, it was quite short-lived. It did not give Ukraine, from a military point of view, some kind of an advantage to carry out successful counteroffensives because, within 24 hours, the Wagner forces had returned back to their bases. Now, the advantage that it may give them, it's more or less some kind of a media propaganda, to use this to show that Russia is weak, that they do not have, the kind of coordination that they had demonstrated. It further shows that perhaps there's some kind of a fatigue going on in the Russian front, but also that there is a strong disagreement between the Ministry of Defense and the Wagner forces, which of course means that that level of trust between Russian forces, regular forces, and Wagner mercenaries is not there. So that is some way or somehow an area that I believe that the Ukrainians could exploit, especially in areas where Wagner forces have been stationed. If, for example, Amarachi, some of the Wagner forces decide that they do not want to sign any contracts under the Ministry of Defense, what would that mean? In essence, is that all the areas where Wagner forces have been stationed in Ukraine, they would have to vacate those areas. And they've proven to be quite formidable. And so perhaps these very changes at the top could just be an advantage for the Ukrainians. But let's watch and see.
Indeed, we'll watch and see, David, and this is Joke Rogers here for you, not Amarachi, just saying. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that correction, Joke. Thank you. Yeah.
It's fine. It happens. Okay, so thank you for your thoughts on that, and we'll see you again soon, I'm sure.
Thank you, Joke, for your time, and have a great day.
Yes.